Is crime really soaring around the world? Or is that just what we think is happening? It's a question many of us ask in passing, influenced by the headlines we see, the news we hear, and the conversations we have. We've all seen it, the constant stream of reports about murder, theft, and violence. Sometimes it feels like crime is everywhere, and it's only getting worse. It's easy to assume that danger lurks around every corner. But what if everything we've been led to believe is not entirely true? What if, despite what the media tells us, crime isn't rising as much as we think? What if the stories that get the most attention, the ones that make us afraid, aren't the full picture? This is where things get interesting. The reality of crime, when we look closely at the numbers, isn't as grim as it seems. Public perception and actual crime statistics often don't align. And that's exactly what we're here to explore. In this video, we're going to dig deep into the facts and figures that challenge the narrative of a world consumed by crime. You might be surprised at what we find. Before we dive in, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Make sure to hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode of Real Crime Saga, where we break down the facts behind the headlines. Now let's get into it. Crime and headlines versus crime and reality. We've all been there, scrolling through our social media feeds, watching news reports, or overhearing conversations where someone casually mentions crime is out of control these days. It's a sentiment we've heard repeatedly, and honestly, it feels right. After all, the news is filled with violent crimes, tragic stories, and shocking headlines. When we're bombarded by these narratives day in and day out, it's hard not to feel like we're living in a time when crime is more prevalent than ever before. But what if I told you that the picture painted by these headlines isn't always the full truth? You see, sensational headlines are designed to grab attention. They draw us in with dramatic language and shocking imagery. But the reality is much more complex. While it's true that certain crimes are always making the news, violent crimes like shootings, burglaries, or fraud, these stories tend to dominate the public conversation. They create a perception that crime is skyrocketing everywhere. It's the kind of narrative we're exposed to constantly. But when we zoom out and look at the actual crime statistics, we see a different story unfolding. Over the past several decades, many categories of crime have stabilized or even declined in many parts of the world. Violent crimes, in particular, have seen a notable drop in some of the most urbanized and developed nations. Murders, assaults, and robberies, once on the rise, have fallen. In fact, in many countries, violent crime rates today are lower than they were 30 or 40 years ago. For example, the rate of violent crime in some major U.S. cities has decreased significantly from the 1990s to the present day. And globally, property crimes like theft and burglary have also seen declines, despite what we may think when we turn on the news. Why does this discrepancy exist? Well, part of the reason is that fear sells. News outlets, social media platforms, and even some public figures thrive on sensationalism. It's easier to grab attention with a headline that screams crime surge than it is to convey the nuanced truth about long-term crime trends. What's more, many crimes go unreported. Theft, domestic violence, and cybercrimes are just a few examples of incidents that often don't make the headlines, but contribute to the overall crime picture. When these figures aren't included in the narrative, it skews our perception. As we continue this deep dive into the truth behind crime trends, we'll explore how the data doesn't always match the stories we hear. But it's important to remember, crime is real, and it affects people's lives. However, understanding the facts allows us to see things in perspective and make better decisions, both as individuals and as a society. Let's keep going. Why numbers and perception don't match. Now that we've explored the gap between the headlines and the reality of crime trends, let's take a closer look at how crime data is actually collected and why this process can sometimes lead to a misleading picture. First, it's important to understand that crime statistics are usually gathered from official reports, meaning they come from police departments, local authorities, and governmental bodies. On the surface, this seems straightforward, right? If a crime happens, it gets reported, and those numbers are tallied up to give us an idea of what's going on. But here's the catch. Not every crime gets reported. In fact, many crimes go unreported for a variety of reasons. Sometimes, victims are afraid to come forward, whether because they fear retaliation or because they don't trust the authorities. Other times, people simply don't report crimes because they feel helpless or think that nothing will be done. For instance, incidents like domestic violence, theft, and sexual assault often don't make it into official crime statistics, even though they happen regularly. This creates an inherent flaw in the system. The crime data we see is incomplete. What we're seeing in the official crime statistics is only a fraction of the true picture. The real number of crimes might be much higher than we realize, but because so many of them go unreported, we end up with skewed figures that don't reflect the full scope of the issue. Now, let's talk about media influence. This is where things get particularly interesting. In today's world, we are constantly bombarded with news about crime. Whether it's on social media, traditional news outlets, or viral videos, crime stories are everywhere. And while this keeps the public informed, it also has a significant impact on our perception of crime. The media tends to focus on the most dramatic and shocking incidents. These stories are attention-grabbing and often sensationalized to make them stand out. A brutal murder, a large-scale robbery, or a violent attack in a public space will often dominate the headlines for days. But here's the problem. These stories are outliers. They represent the rare, extreme cases that don't reflect the broader, more typical trends in crime. What's more, the focus on sensational crimes creates a culture of fear. When we repeatedly hear about violent acts and heinous crimes, our perception of the world begins to shift. We start thinking that crime is everywhere, that danger lurks at every turn, even if crime rates are actually falling in many areas. The more we hear about these incidents, the more likely we are to believe that they're becoming more frequent. This is where we can introduce the concept of fear versus fact in crime reporting. Fear, driven by media sensationalism, can distort the reality of crime trends. It can make us feel like we're living in a time of rampant criminal activity, even when the statistics show the opposite. It's not just about the numbers, it's about how those numbers are framed and what gets emphasized. Crime data might show a steady decrease in certain types of crime, but the constant cycle of dramatic media coverage makes it difficult to see the full picture. This discrepancy between what we fear and what the facts tell us is why we need to question the narrative we're often handed. So, what can we do with this information? The first step is to recognize the impact of media on our perceptions. When we see a headline that screams crime surge, we have to remember that sensational stories often don't reflect the day-to-day reality. It's crucial to approach these reports with skepticism and to rely on the broader data trends rather than isolated incidents. In the next section, we'll take a deeper look at local variations, how crime trends can differ dramatically depending on where you are. Even in areas where crime is decreasing on the whole, certain regions or neighborhoods might still experience an uptick in criminal activity. Let's explore that next. Local variations. As we continue exploring the complex nature of crime trends, it's important to understand that while national crime statistics give us a broad view of the situation, they can also hide significant local variations. A decline in crime at the national level doesn't necessarily mean that crime is declining everywhere. In fact, certain neighborhoods or cities might be experiencing an entirely different reality, one that starkly contrasts with national averages. Imagine a country where the overall crime rate has been falling for years, but when you zoom in on a specific city or district, the story changes. You find that violent crime, such as robberies or shootings, has been on the rise in some areas, even though the overall trend across the country is down. This is a perfect example of how national trends can mask local spikes in criminal activity. In fact, some of the most dangerous areas in any given city or region might experience a rise in crime that national statistics fail to capture. These areas often face unique challenges, such as higher poverty rates, limited access to education, or increased gang activity, that drive higher crime rates, even if the national picture suggests a safer environment. Take theft or fraud, for example. Nationally, we might see property crimes like burglary or car theft steadily decline over the years. But in certain areas, particularly densely populated urban centers or regions hit hard by economic hardship, these crimes might be on a rise. It's often in these pockets of vulnerability that certain crimes thrive, unnoticed by the broader public. In some cases, fraud is a growing concern, with increasingly sophisticated schemes targeting vulnerable communities. Cybercrime, for instance, has been rapidly escalating in recent years. And while overall crime may be dropping, these digital offenses continue to increase in specific cities or regions where there's a higher concentration of online activity and less awareness about protective measures. When we think about crime, we often assume it's a uniform trend, something that rises or falls equally across the board. But the reality is much more like a patchwork quilt, with some areas experiencing significant surges in crime, while others benefit from long periods of peace and stability. In one neighborhood, you might hear of a crime spree, dozens of homes broken into, cars stolen, or businesses targeted by thieves. While just a few miles away, another neighborhood is seeing fewer incidents, benefiting from strong community programs or improved law enforcement tactics. These local variations are key to understanding the broader picture of crime. While national statistics can give us an idea of trends over time, they don't always capture the full scale of crime in specific areas. That's why it's crucial to pay attention to local news, police reports, and community feedback to get a more accurate understanding of what's happening in your own area. Moreover, addressing crime on a local level requires a tailored approach. Generalized strategies might not be effective in areas where the underlying issues, like poverty, unemployment, or a lack of education, are contributing to the rise in criminal activity. Local governments and communities need to work together to develop strategies that target the unique causes of crime in their area, rather than simply applying one-size-fits-all solutions based on national trends. The patchwork nature of crime is why it's so important not to judge the state of crime solely by national statistics. Instead, we need to consider the broader context, including local dynamics, community engagement, and the underlying factors that drive criminal behavior. As we move forward in this exploration of crime data, it's clear that we can't just look at the numbers in isolation. Crime is not uniform. It's a complex, multifaceted issue that varies from place to place. In the next chapter, we'll zoom out even further and look at the historical context of crime trends, examining how long-term changes help us understand the ebb and flow of criminal activity over decades. The broader historical context. Now that we've explored how local variations can skew our perception of crime, it's time to zoom out and look at the broader historical context. When we consider crime trends, it's essential to place current rates in perspective, especially in a world where sensational headlines can make even minor increases in crime seem catastrophic. The truth is, crime is not a simple linear progression that constantly increases or decreases. It ebbs and flows, influenced by a variety of factors, and understanding this long-term picture is key to seeing things clearly. Let's take a moment to reflect on history. If we compare crime rates today to those of several decades ago, the numbers may surprise you. For example, in the 1990s, many Western countries, particularly the United States, experienced some of the highest levels of violent crime in modern history. Cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago were notorious for their high murder rates, gang violence, and drug-related crimes. Back then, it seemed as though crime was spiraling out of control. But today, the situation looks very different. In the U.S., violent crime rates have dropped significantly since the peaks of the 1990s. Murders, assaults, and robberies are far less common than they were during that time. And it's not just in the U.S. Many countries around the world, including the UK, Canada, and several European nations, have seen declines in violent crime since the late 20th century. This is especially true when compared to the mid to late 20th century, when urban crime rates were at their highest. What's happening here? How is it that, in a time where the media is constantly telling us that crime is increasing, we're actually seeing long-term declines in certain types of crime? The answer lies in the complex interplay of social, economic, and policy changes that have shaped crime rates over the years. For one, police reforms, advancements in technology, and better community policing have all played a role in reducing crime rates in many places. Law enforcement agencies are better equipped to handle investigations, track criminal activity, and prevent crimes before they happen. On top of that, efforts to address the root causes of crime, such as poverty, education, and healthcare, have led to improvements in community resilience and fewer individuals turning to criminal activity. We also have to consider the impact of changing drug laws and mental health initiatives. For decades, the war on drugs fueled mass incarceration and fueled violent crimes. But in more recent years, there has been a shift toward harm reduction and addressing the underlying causes of addiction. This shift, combined with growing support for mental health treatment, has had a positive impact on crime reduction in many areas. This broader historical context also reinforces a critical point. Crime is rarely a simple upward or downward line. It's not always a case of crime continually increasing or always decreasing in a steady pattern. Instead, crime follows cycles. It surges at times due to specific triggers, such as economic recessions or social unrest, and then recedes when society makes concerted efforts to address underlying issues. For instance, gang violence spiked in certain cities during the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s and early 1990s, but that crisis eventually subsided as law enforcement and community programs began to curb the influence of gangs. Similarly, crime rates surged during the economic downturns of previous decades, but fell again as economies recovered and social programs were put into place to help those most at risk. It's also worth noting that certain types of crime, like violent assaults and homicides, while they may be on the rise in some areas today, are often still far lower than the peaks they hit in the past. Yes, we may see a rise in some crime rates in the short term, but when we look at the longer view, it becomes clear that these fluctuations are part of a larger pattern of progress. What does this mean for us? It's a reminder that, as unsettling as crime may seem in the present moment, the story of crime is far more complicated than it might appear at first glance. Short-term increases in crime don't necessarily mean a permanent upward trajectory. They may simply be part of a larger trend or cycle. Understanding this long-term historical context allows us to separate temporary fears from real, long-lasting changes in criminal activity. In the next section, we'll dive into the challenges of interpreting crime data and how different sources of information can give us conflicting pictures of the state of crime. Stay tuned as we explore how to make sense of the numbers behind the headlines. The challenges of interpreting crime data. Now that we've explored the broader historical context of crime, it's time to delve into one of the most critical aspects of understanding crime trends: the challenges of interpreting crime data. At first glance, crime data might seem like a straightforward reflection of reality. After all, numbers don't lie, right? Well, the truth is the story behind those numbers is more complicated than it appears. The first challenge we face when interpreting crime data is that different sources of data often tell very different stories. The most common sources of crime data come from official police reports and victimization surveys. At first glance, these two seem like they should match up fairly well, but in reality, they can diverge dramatically. Police reports are the backbone of most crime statistics. They represent crimes that have been officially reported to law enforcement and documented in police records. This might seem like a solid way to measure crime, but there's a problem. Not every crime is reported. As we discussed earlier, many crimes, especially those like domestic violence, sexual assault, and petty theft, go unreported for a variety of reasons. This means that the numbers we see from police reports often underestimate the actual amount of crime occurring in society. On the other hand, victimization surveys attempt to fill in those gaps by asking individuals about their experiences with crime, regardless of whether they've reported it to the authorities. These surveys can provide a more complete picture of crime, especially in cases where the police data is incomplete. However, even these surveys have limitations. People may underreport their own experiences with crime, either due to shame, fear, or simply forgetting the incident. As a result, victimization surveys still have their own level of imperfection. So, what happens when we try to use these two sources together? Well, they don't always align. Police reports may show one thing, while victimization surveys indicate a very different trend. For instance, a city might report a decline in burglaries through police data, but victimization surveys might show that people still feel increasingly unsafe in their homes. This disparity highlights the complexities of using a single data source to assess the full scale of crime. Another significant challenge in interpreting crime data is the political narratives and reporting priorities that often shape the way crime is presented to the public. Crime statistics don't exist in a vacuum. They are often filtered through the lens of political agendas, media priorities, and public policy. Depending on the political climate, certain types of crime might be emphasized over others. For example, during times of political unrest or in the run-up to an election, candidates might focus on certain crimes, such as violent crime or drug-related offenses, because they resonate more with voters. In contrast, issues like white-collar crime or corporate corruption, which might be just as harmful but less visible to the public, might not receive the same level of attention. Similarly, news outlets often focus on the most sensational crimes, because those stories get higher ratings and attract more attention. This focus on high-profile cases, like mass shootings, terrorist attacks, or police brutality, can lead to the perception that crime is more rampant than it actually is. When a media spends days or weeks covering a single event, it can feel like the frequency of such incidents is increasing, even if overall crime rates are stable or declining. This bias in reporting skews our perception of crime, making us believe it's on the rise when, in fact, it may not be. Additionally, the way data is presented also plays a huge role in shaping public perception. For example, a rise in property crimes might be reported as a crime wave, even if the actual increase is small or within the normal fluctuations of crime. The language used in the media can make even minor upticks seem catastrophic. Instead of presenting crime data in context, the focus is often on generating fear or shock to keep people engaged. This sensationalism contributes to an atmosphere of fear, even if crime rates in a given area are relatively low. So, how do we navigate this maze of conflicting data, political influence, and sensationalized reporting? The key is to critically analyze the data. Rather than relying on headlines alone, it's crucial to dig deeper into the numbers. Look at long-term trends rather than short-term spikes. Understand the sources of the data you're working with and consider the limitations and biases inherent in them. It's also important to pay attention to context. Data is only meaningful when placed in the correct context. Consider the economic, social, and political factors that could be influencing crime trends. For example, a rise in certain crimes might be linked to an economic downturn or a change in policing strategies, not necessarily a direct increase in criminal behavior. Finally, always be aware of the fear factor in crime reporting. Fear sells, and the media knows it. Headlines designed to alarm us can distort our perception of the facts. By taking the time to analyze crime data thoughtfully and critically, we can get a clearer, more accurate picture of what's actually happening in the world. In the next section, we'll explore the real-world implications of how we interpret crime data and how this affects policy decisions, community safety, and public perception. Stick with me as we continue to untangle the complex narrative of crime in our society. Implications for society. As we've explored the complexities of crime trends, data sources, and the differences between fear and fact, it's time to reflect on the real-world impact these discrepancies have on our society. The way we perceive crime, and the way crime is presented to us, can profoundly shape the policies we support, the behavior of our communities, and even the resources allocated to fight crime. When we react based on fear rather than facts, the consequences ripple through every aspect of society. One of the most immediate and visible effects of fear of crime is how it influences public policy. Politicians, driven by public sentiment, often respond to the perception of crime, even if those perceptions are exaggerated or distorted. When communities feel that crime is on the rise, whether because of dramatic media reports or sensational headlines, there's a call for tougher laws, stricter sentencing, and more policing. This may sound like a reasonable response, but it doesn't always address the root causes of crime. Instead, it can lead to policies that focus more on punishment than prevention, often disregarding underlying social issues like poverty, education, or mental health. Community behavior is also shaped by our perceptions of crime. When people believe that crime is rampant, they might become more cautious, less trusting of others, or even more isolated in their own neighborhoods. Fear can cause individuals to stay indoors, limit their interactions with neighbors, and withdraw from local community activities. This lack of engagement only worsens the situation, as it reduces opportunities for community-building efforts that could help prevent crime in the first place. At the same time, resource allocation is heavily influenced by public fear. If a community believes crime is out of control, there's often a push for more funding for law enforcement agencies and crime prevention programs. While this isn't necessarily a bad thing, it can come at the expense of other critical resources that could address the root causes of crime. For example, investments in education, mental health services, and job training programs are often sidelined, despite their proven effectiveness in reducing crime over the long term. When we understand crime trends accurately, we make more informed decisions about where to direct our efforts and how to approach crime prevention. If we look beyond the sensational headlines and analyze the facts behind the numbers, we can focus on solutions that truly make a difference. Solutions that address not just the symptoms of crime, but its causes. This brings us to some important reflective questions that we should all consider. Are we reacting to actual crime, or just the stories we hear? The media plays a powerful role in shaping our perceptions. Are we making decisions based on real data, or are we influenced by fear-driven stories that skew our understanding of the situation? How does perception shape policy? When politicians and policymakers react to perceived crime rates, are they responding to actual data, or are they simply reflecting the fears of the public? And what are the consequences of these decisions for our communities? By asking these questions, we can begin to understand the broader implications of how we approach crime. We must move beyond knee-jerk reactions to headlines and instead look at comprehensive data that tells the whole story, not just the sensational parts. The numbers may not always match the headlines, but the real story of crime, complex, nuanced, and revealing, is worth uncovering. It's up to us to challenge the narratives, seek out the truth, and make informed choices that lead to safer, stronger communities.